Hi, my name is Tyler Engelman, and today we will be going over the First Barbary War, what it was over, and the impacts that it had on the United States as a country. In order to fully understand what the First Barbary War was about, we need to take a step back and look at the historical context of the time. In 1783, the United States and Great Britain had signed the Treaty of Paris, which granted the United States its own independence. Independence definitely had its benefits for the United States, but it had a drawback. You see, the merchant vessels of the 13 colonies had heavily relied on the protection of the British Navy from the pirates based out of the Barbary States. The Barbary States consisted of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers, all of which were autonomous vassals of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the independent Kingdom of Morocco. All of these places were located in North Africa. For centuries, pirates based out of these countries had made considerable amounts of money from boarding trading ships and ransoming, as well as selling the crews into slavery. When the United States was a colony of Britain, they didn't need to fear the Barbary States because the British were on good terms with them, mostly due to the British having a large, powerful navy that the Barbary States were afraid of. But when the United States gained its independence, it lost its status as a British colony, and in place, the Barbary States saw a weak nation with vulnerable trade ships and started attacking its merchants. In order to protect its merchants, the United States established multiple treaties with the Barbary States in which the U.S. would pay large amounts of tribute in exchange for protection. In 1786, the United States paid Morocco a one-time tribute of $20,000. In 1795, it paid Algiers a tribute of $642,500. And finally, in 1796, it paid Tripoli an annual tribute of $18,000. For the time period, this was a considerable amount of money, but at least it kept its merchants safe. In the year 1801, Thomas Jefferson was elected as the third president of the United States. The ruler of Tripoli at the time, Yusuf Karamanli, demanded that the new United States pay a higher tribute than what was agreed upon in the earlier treaty of 1796. Karamanli was mad that the United States was paying its tribute late. For Jefferson, however, this was not an option as he had campaigned on lowering the federal expenses of the countries. Jefferson also felt that the United States should not pay tribute to any other nation on principle as it made the United States look weak. With this in mind, Jefferson refused Karamanli's demands. In response, on May 14th of 1801, Yusuf Karamanli declared war on the United States, and this was symbolized by the chopping down of the American flagpole at the United States consulate in the capital city, Tripoli. At the start of the war, the United States already had a naval presence in the Mediterranean, as Jefferson had recently ordered for the Navy to protect merchant ships there. Jefferson quickly organized a blockade of Tripoli's ports, the most important port being the port at the capital city of Tripoli. The first battle took place on August 1st of 1801 in an encounter between the USS Enterprise and a ship named the Tripoli. When the Enterprise encountered the Tripoli, the Enterprise was sailing under British flags. The Tripoli sailed up to the Enterprise, and the two captains of each ship had a conversation with each other. During the conversation, Captain Sterrett of the Enterprise learned that the Tripoli was currently hunting for American ships. Upon learning this, the Enterprise hoisted American flags and opened fire on the Tripoli until it surrendered. This was the first naval win for the Americans in the Barbary Wars. In 1802, in response to Jefferson's request for the constitutional power to deal with Tripoli, Congress passed the Act for Protection of Commerce and Seamen of the United States against the Tripolitan Corsairs, which was essentially a declaration of war. In June of 1802, the Kingdom of Morocco declared war on the United States in order to help its ally Tripoli. But August of the same year, Morocco would go on to negotiate peace with the United States in exchange for closer relationship between the two countries. During the blockade of Tripoli harbor, on the 31st of October, the frigate of the USS Philadelphia collided with an uncharted reef and got stuck. The Tripolitans in the harbor seized this opportunity and captured the ship, as well as its crew. Even though the ship couldn't sail anymore, they anchored it to the harbor and used its cannons to open fire against the Americans. In February of 1804, the USS Intrepid, led by Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, sailed into the harbor under the cover of darkness disguised as a merchant vessel. The Intrepid sailed up to the Philadelphia, and Marines beneath the Intrepid's deck snuck on board the Philadelphia and set it ablaze. The Intrepid and its crew quickly got away, and Decatur was hailed as a hero across the United States. The reason why the U.S. chose to sink the USS Philadelphia is because they knew that if it were to be repaired by the Tripolitans, that it would go on to become the strongest boat in their navy, and that was just not something that they could afford to have happen. In August of 1804, a plan was devised to convert the USS Intrepid into a quote-unquote floating volcano. The plan was to load the ship with hundreds of explosive barrels and to ignite the ship right next to the pirate fleet under the cover of darkness. Ideally, the Intrepid would be used as a mega bomb of sorts and would sacrifice itself in exchange for sinking many of the enemy boats. Unfortunately for the Intrepid, that's not how the events played out. As the Intrepid was sailing towards the harbor under the cover of darkness, it was spotted by the Tripolitans, and they opened fire upon the Intrepid. One of the shots hit one of the explosive barrels on the Intrepid, causing a chain reaction which instantly devoured and exploded the Intrepid, and all of the sailors on board died. In 1801, James Cathcart and William Eaton proposed a coup in which Yusuf Karamanli, the leader of Tripoli, would be overthrown by his brother, Hamid Karamanli, who had ruled Tripoli just a couple of years prior. In 1802, Secretary of State James Madison approved this plan and ordered Eaton to find Hamid and to get him to go along with the plan. Eaton found Hamid in the city of Alexandria in Egypt and convinced him to go along with the idea. From Egypt, Eaton and Hamid recruited hundreds of mercenaries, and with the mercenaries, as well as 8 U.S. Marines, they marched 500 miles towards Tripoli. In late April of 1805, they captured the town of Derna and defended it from Tripolitan attackers for a couple of days. And for the first time ever, the American flag was raised in victory over foreign soil. With the blockade and the bombardment of Tripoli harbor, the capture of Derna, and the fear of a coup, Yusuf Karamanli was finally willing to make peace with the United States. Under the Treaty of Tripoli, which was signed on June 10, 1805, the United States and Tripoli ceased hostilities with each other. Both sides freed each other's prisoners, although the Americans had to pay an additional ransom fee of $60,000, and the U.S. withdrew its army from Derna. The treaty also guaranteed the protection of Hamid Karamanli, as well as the secured release of his family, which was captured during the war, although they weren't released until 4 years after the peace was signed. It's unknown what the exact costs of the First Barbary War are. It is known that it was an incredibly expensive amount due to the constant amounts of ransom that the United States had to pay each time that a boat would break through a blockade and find a merchant vessel, as well as the ransom of the crew of the Philadelphia. On top of having to pay lots of ransoms, just funding the Navy needed to have all the blockades was also a huge expense to the U.S. There were a lot of casualties in the First Barbary War. On the American side, 35 people were killed and 64 were wounded. The exact figures aren't quite as clear on the Tripolitan side, but it's estimated that there's about 800 men that were killed and 1,200 that were wounded. On top of this, due to the blockades of many harbors such as Tripoli's harbor, many civilians were probably made to starve to death because they couldn't import food. The Tripoli Monument, which is located in Annapolis, honors the fallen of the First Barbary War, and it's one of the oldest standing military statues in the United States. With the end of the First Barbary War, the United States only enjoyed a brief moment of peace with the Barbary States, as 10 years later the Second Barbary War kicked off, this time between the United States and Algiers. Back home, Jefferson faced criticism from the Federalists for abandoning our ally Hamlet Caramanley and our promise that we would instate him as the ruler of Tripoli. And the Federalists also criticized Jefferson for paying tribute to our enemies. Another impact of the First Barbary War is that it increased the naval experience of the United States. This experience would come in handy 7 years later in the War of 1812, where we fought the British in many naval battles across Lake Erie. You can even see references to the First Barbary War today in the U.S. Marines mantra, with the line, "To the Swords of Tripoli," commemorating the time that the 8 Marines, as well as the mercenary army, captured the town of Derna. This year is my works cited. The first source here from the University of Michigan gave a really convenient timeline of the Barbary Wars. The second source explained many terms of the treaties and conditions. The third source, which I found using the JSTOR database, gave a full-on depth details of the war, the battles, the treaties, just everything, not only from the perspective of the United States, but also from Tripoli, which was really useful. The fourth source, Monticello, gave a lot of insight into what motivated Jefferson for his decisions on the war and the peace treaties and such. The fifth source gave a really, really nice, just a lot of information about the USS Enterprise and what it did in the battle, especially with its encounter of the boat, the Tripoli. And then finally, the last source gave lots of details about the USS Philadelphia and the Intrepid and their roles in the First Barbary War. And finally, this is where my works cited is for all the pictures that I used throughout this presentation. This has been my presentation on the First Barbary War. Thank you for listening.